Purposely. Your life, God's purpose. Listen at purposely.com.
If you had to start all over again with a brand new name, who would you pick to give you a name? Probably somebody who knew you pretty well, right? What if it was someone wholly unexpected? Hey, it's Jen, and welcome back to the Bible with Busy People, where we are talking about the names of God. And the first time in Scripture someone gave God a name, it was someone completely unexpected, a foreign woman who was a slave. We're going to be reading in Genesis 16 today, and there are a few key players we need to know about and some background to get into. Two of the key players are Abram and Sarai, later known as Abraham and Sarah, and they would be the parents of the nation of Israel, who would be God's people. At this point, we know that Abram is a descendant of Noah. He has a nephew named Lot, and he's married to Sarai. God told him to leave his people and go to a new land, and he would become a great nation. He would have a great name, and God would bless him, and all people would be blessed through him. This is in Genesis 12. So Abraham listened. He took Sarai and Lot's family and all their household, and they followed God. However, we find out in Genesis 16 that even though God promised a few times that a child would be coming, that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, God has not yet said that Sarah would be the one to have the child. Let's start in Genesis 16, verses 1 to 6. It says, Abram's wife, Sarai, had not borne any children for him, but she owned an Egyptian slave named Hagar. Sarai said to Abram, "Since the Lord has prevented me from bearing children, go to my slave. Perhaps through her I can build a family." And Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So Abram's wife, Sarai, took Hagar, her Egyptian slave, and gave her to her husband, Abram, as a wife for him. This happened after Abram had lived in the land of Canaan 10 years. He slept with Hagar, and she became pregnant. When she saw that she was pregnant, her mistress became contemptible to her. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for my suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and when she saw that she was pregnant, I became contemptible to her. May the Lord judge between me and you." Abram replied to Sarai, "Here, your slave is in your power. Do whatever you want with her." Then Sarai mistreated her so much that she ran away from her. Let's talk about Sarai. I think she gets a bad rep for being faithless, but maybe she was. I also think maybe she was being practical and being quote-unquote faithful in that way. This wouldn't have been an unusual arrangement in their culture for the man of the household to marry a slave and try to produce heirs through the slave or the servant. It doesn't mean it was part of God's plan to develop the Israelite people this way, but it wouldn't have been uncommon in society at the time. Sometimes I wonder if Sarai had actually talked to God about her questions, if things would have been different. I guess we'll never know. And now on to slavery. Again, it was not unusual in their culture, and unfortunately, it's a practice that has continued in society through generations. I think similar to the marriage arrangements, this was cultural, but not part of God's plan or will. As we see in Scripture again and again, God cares for the foreigner, for those in need, and for the oppressed. He makes special provision for them. As we see, he sees and he cares, and he cared that Hagar was mistreated by Sarai. Now I want to think about if we can imagine Hagar's position here. She was a slave taken from her homeland, Egypt, and she was considered property to a woman who clearly had no reservations about abusing her, in a household that used her like a pawn to produce heirs and forced her into marriage. I wonder what her image of God was, considering how she was treated. She must have known that Abram and Sarai worshipped God. She must have known that they were following God to a whole new place. I'm curious to see what she would have thought, being in that household, being treated the way that she was. Let's continue in Genesis 16. In verse 7 it says, "The angel of the Lord found her, Hagar, by a spring in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. He said, 'Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?' She replied, I'm running away from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, Go back to your mistress and submit to her authority. The angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your offspring, and they will be too many to count. The angel of the Lord said to her, You have conceived and will have a son. You will name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your cry of affliction. This man will be like a wild donkey. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. He will settle near all his relatives. So she named the Lord who spoke to her. You are El-Roi, for she said, In this place have I actually seen the one who sees me? That is why the well is called Bir Lahai Roi. Bir Lahai Roi. It is between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar gave birth to Abram's son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. In this moment, God actually reaches out to speak to Hagar. As someone who would not have been seen or considered, who had been used and abused, this would have meant everything. Can you imagine that God would stop and speak with her, that he would care for her in her need and in her desperation? God said he had heard her cry, and he told her he would provide for her son. And so Hagar gave him a name, El-Roi, the God who sees me. Interestingly, God told Hagar that her son should be named Ishmael, which means God hears. God seeing and hearing Hagar gave her identity. And Hagar naming God gave her a sense of assertion as a human being with dignity and a special connection with God. And while she did have to return to what might have been a difficult situation, I truly believe that she went with newfound confidence. I really believe that things changed between her and Sarai in their day-to-day interactions. Later, when Sarah has a baby of her own and casts out Hagar and Ishmael, God meets Hagar in the desert again. He promises again to care for her and her people through Ishmael. God sees and God hears. And I really want you to remember this today, that no matter what lonely or isolated space you find yourself in, maybe in a desert space or a desolate place, no matter what injustice is happening to you or around you, and no matter how spiritual, quote unquote, you are or aren't, no matter how insignificant you might feel, I want you to remember that God sees and he hears. God is with you today as you go about your day. I'll see you again tomorrow for another Name of God.
Thank you for listening to The Bible for Busy People. If you need prayer or want to go deeper in your faith, visit our show notes. Will you take a moment to share with a friend and leave a review? It helps the Bible get into even more people's minds and hearts. Find more podcasts that will recharge you at purposely.com.